Hi everyone. I thought I would talk. As usual, I'm having trouble. This is like the fifth time I've tried to make a video. I just have so much trouble sometimes getting my words out and saying how I feel, and I've been that way my whole life. But let me just say this. I was going to talk about, before I go into like deeper, darker political stuff, just the 45 being in England today with Melania. Now, fake Melania. No, I actually do think it's her, and I'll tell you why. I think it's both of them. It's the real. First I thought, well, how would we know if they sent a body double of both of them or one of them, mixed match, to England? What if the real 45 stayed here and we thought he's over there, but he's actually here watching the news just like us, watching his body double in England? And I thought, no, he's not going to pass that up. His whole past life, which I've always felt his past life was King Henry VIII, one of his past lives. But also just his desire to be treated like King Cinderella, the carriage and the pomp and circumstance and the gold and the high tea and all these things and soldiers and the crowds and Gilded Age. He really loves that. It's part of his past life. He really is not gonna, he wasn't gonna pass that up. He feels like he deserves it. This is his field trip away from work. And he'd like that to be in America. He wants to be treated like a king, King Cinderella. So he's there. I really feel like that's him. And Melania, you would say, well, maybe it's fake Melania because the height differences, you see when they're together at times there's difference in height. I feel it's her. And she's wearing that ridiculous hat. And you might say, well, maybe the hat is a clue because she's hiding her fake Melania face. But I don't think that's it. She's hiding her real Melania face because she's miserable. And it's her way to get through her role of good wife and first lady and not have everyone see how miserable she is. She's getting through it by hiding under that hat. So I think it's both of them. It's real. I was going to pull cards, but I really feel like it's them. It's the real Melania, the real 45. They're there. Now I don't know why they're being allowed because he's got some pretty heavy duty crimes, and it's true. I'm not making that up. It's a fact. But I'll say for entertainment purposes only, he's a felon and other horrible things. But I guess that's up to England. We're still technically an ally, so I understand that that's part of the agreement that we make good with each other. But it sure would make a strong statement if our allies would say to us, we don't accept your behavior of how you're treating people and other countries and us and all these things. And so you can't come here and have these benefits and have us treat you a certain way if you're not going to be a nice human. But that's not what they're doing. And I imagine, I just got this, that a large part of it is, I've always gotten this, that they made a pact with the Queen before she passed away that they would never betray the family name by outing Prince Andrew with the whole Epstein information. And they literally, they made a promise, like King Charles made a promise to his mother that he would play the game. And someone else may betray them and get the news out, which the news has already been put out anyway. So part of this playing nice is the complete ignorance of the truth of what happened with Epstein and Prince Andrew and 45, and they're just playing a game of make-believe and pretend in front of the public, and that's all goes back to the Queen. So for entertainment purposes only, that's what I get. So that's happening. Now, that's sort of a lighthearted topic. The darker topic is, we'll go to I'll say Charlie, right? Charlie K, because the name is so controversial. And I made a post on my community board about why it felt so similar to me, even though I'm completely never, political, has nothing to do with me at all. But a feeling that I had that was so similar of the how people are, and I just saw 444, of how people are reacting, like on the far right, Republicans, etc., are reacting to Charlie's passing and he was killed. And just like their extreme reaction of grief and horror and So I had this lady at work, and I heard her and another person, and I always knew she was a Republican, but I try not to. I don't really want to know. Because you have to work with people. And I heard them sort of whispering, and I said, "Oh, I'll just leave it alone. I'll leave it alone. I don't want to hear." But then after work, she said something to me. We're walking to our cars, and she said, "Oh, anybody could blow our head off now. Any one of us." And and I thought to myself, well, that's a bit extreme. I mean, that's most likely not going to happen. And this was a political landscape the size of, like JFK type of, not the same human, obviously, and values at all, but in the world of politics, it was like that. It was a public assassination, which is different than just us walking on the streets. That's likely not going to happen to us. There were political reasons why it happened to him. Most of us are fine. But see, in her mind, it's because this has been painted on the far right that Democrats and liberals are ready to just, I don't know, go crazy and start hurting everyone. I'm a Democrat liberal. I have no desire, none. And I'll tell you what, as a Democrat and a liberal, I didn't even think about Charlie K. I knew who he was. I knew he was far right. I knew he said something like on the lines of Leland and Andrew Tate. I knew he was in that sort of realm of, toxic male type of, had a lot of work to do. And said some not so nice things, probably connected to the NRA, all that. But that's it. I literally have never sat around thinking about him. Yeah, I'm not. And I don't sit around thinking about evil things I want to do or how I would hurt Republicans, or I'm not like that. I'm very anti-violent, very anti-gun, very much that we need to talk things out and try to find a peaceful ways. We could totally hate each other, but we should find peace. At the end of the day, we should coexist peacefully, whichever way possible. And we should have sensible gun control. And so, she said that, and I thought, my God, they've really been brain warped to fear and hate Democrats so much that they think that we're violent. And I literally don't know any violent Democrats. I'm not violent. I don't know any. We talk. We use words. We're anti-gun. We don't want to take away people's rights, Second Amendment, but we also don't like violence and guns. We want to talk things out. You work on yourself. You work on communication. You work on your community. We find ways to work things out. Protesting, okay, signs. That's a version of talking. We don't want to use violence as an end to a means. We want to use words and work things out peacefully. So I said to her, well, we really should have some gun control. That would help. And I said it nicely. That would be we need gun control, just like that. And she's like, oh, well, but you got crazy people. And then I thought, so here's the connection. They're brain warping them on the right that Democrats are crazy, that we're part of a crazy group, that we're radical, and that we're violent. And then right then at the same time, that same day, there was that one guy that went on TV and said that they should just euthanize crazy people and homeless people. So you see what they're doing. And I was like, gosh, that is just so wrong. That's so Jim Jones cult mentality. And, instead of just having sensible gun control, by God, no, don't take away the guns, take away the Democrat, which is a human being and part of your citizen that you live amongst in the United States. And, it's like, why is it that we have all this violence in America? And yet the minute you say, let's have some gun control, they literally won't do it. So then I was driving home after work thinking about that. And what I got was, well, guns represent power and white power. And they said 45 represents white power. And I thought, well, that's it. They're just so afraid. They won't do the simple solution of gun control, right? The sensible gun control. They won't do that because it means they lose power. And they're terrified of losing power. And their power goes to white power, unfortunately. And that's what 45 is. That's why they won't let go of 45. They use him as a symbol of white power for entertainment purpose only. So then it all made sense to me. When Spirit told me that, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. But just from a logical standpoint, and pardon my allergy throat, my allergies are killing me. Pardon the expression. So, stick with me. So, I was thinking about this because I always work by examples, right? And symbolism and my own life experiences. And I thought about this time when I was a kid and the block behind ours in our little small town that I lived in. We would go play, we would ride our bikes, and there was still this field out there, and we would have fun, and we'd walk around the field and play. And then one day, the lady who lived adjacent to the field, she brought like her grandson in or something. And he was like this jerk who he would get rocks, and he would start throwing rocks at all of us. And so like our fun, but first we were like, oh, what the heck, he's kind of crazy. And then, and then he just went psycho. And so we had to go in there and tell his grandma, your grandkid's throwing rocks at everyone. And I remember she kind of like brushed it off like, well, he didn't mean to, that type of thing. And it's like, lady, just go put him in a room, go put him in the back room, tell his mom, and, take away TV or what have you, give him a punishment, and then teach him not to throw rocks because we want to play. We lost our freedom of playing in the field on our own street because this kid was throwing rocks. Now you can say, well, that would be, your example sounds like Democrats, but we're not throwing rocks. We're the ones who are saying, stop throwing rocks. That's my whole point. Democrats are saying, stop having guns everywhere. Not taking away, because you can't take away all the rocks, right? You can't take away all the guns, and we do have Second Amendment. We do respect Second Amendment. But let's have some sensible gun control, and also let's stop coddling violent behavior and ideology, and having people like who go on to stages and say in podcasts and pulpits and White Houses and saying things like, I hate Democrats. I hate Taylor Swift. If they're homeless, we should unalive them, etc., etc. Democrats aren't saying that. We're not the ones saying that. We're not the ones promoting hate and violence. We're not perfect. And by the way, I feel like I'm more independent. I've always been more independent. But so it always comes down to that. Where no one will teach the brat and give the brat some punishment that's throwing rocks. So you got guns everywhere, and instead of isolating, first of all, you would calm down the situation, right, by removing some rocks. You get the kid away from the rocks, and you remove some rocks. So there you put the message out, I don't tolerate this, I don't stand for this. But what they just want to do is they want to blame, and they pick a side. So like that grandmother, maybe she thought it was our fault, like maybe we triggered him to throw rocks instead of doing something. And my whole point here is no violence. We don't want violence. We want action, like sensible gun control. So you can't sit there and blame and say that Democrats are evil and violent and hateful. We're literally begging for action and gun control so we don't have violence. That's the whole point. Now, getting down to Charlie K. I saw that video last week. I was writing, I took a break, I looked online, saw it, and I was like, oh my God. And then my first thought was, well, he didn't survive, even though they were still saying he was alive at the time. And it was shocking, it was horrible. I literally cried because even though, like I said, he wasn't even on my radar. I don't hate him, I didn't care, I didn't hate, I didn't care. Wasn't on my radar. And but it was violent. What happened to him was horribly violent, and that's sad. We don't do that to other human beings. I don't agree. Listening now to things that he said, I don't agree with his view. I think that he said some really horrible things. And what is it they say? Violence begets violence. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. It shouldn't happen. It's kind of, I got the feeling of Jesse James, like the way Jesse James lived. Jesse James went around doing horrible things to people, and but still, and then he got, it came, the boomerang of karma came back by his actions that he did to others, wished upon others. And I don't agree with it. I don't like it. But when you're in that realm of the Wild West, you're living in the Wild West. I don't agree with it, but that's the life he was living. That's a life that the far right seems to be living, and they want to blame everyone else. But that's the life. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. I don't agree with it. I don't promote it, but that's what happens. He was living in the Wild West. And but still I cried. It was violent, and I afterwards I was like, my God, I wish I hadn't seen that video. I really could have gone through my whole life and not seen something like that. It was horrible, awful. And then this guy on TikTok, it really made sense. He said, "You have been desensitized." And I thought, yeah, that's true. And that's when I started to think this whole thing was planned. This whole thing was planned. They're desensitizing us to violence, and they're using Democrats as a scapegoat, just like they do in a war. You paint the, one side as the baddies when they're actually humans, and everybody thinks they're right. Each side thinks they're right. You know what I mean? And each side thinks the other side is bad, and you have to paint the other side as a monster so that you don't feel bad when you take them out. That's what generals do. That's what the war mentality of that, brainwashing does. And see what 45 and others like Miller are doing is, and did, because the die has already been cast, is to paint one side of society that they don't want to exist anymore, and that would be Democrats. They want to paint Democrats as the scapegoat that deserves to be taken out. They're saying we're the violent ones. We're the ones who have no reason to be alive. So therefore, and then they have an event, right? They have an event to make us look like when it wasn't us. I could almost guarantee 100,000,000% that it wasn't a Democrat. And the common denominator in all of these violent events that are happening, and they're taking each other out. That's what's interesting. They're taking each other out. The far right, MAGA, etc. But the common denominator is gun ideology, violent ideology. And it's always that family raises the kids with a whole bunch of violence. That a gun is an answer to a solution. That if your silent enemy comes around you and threatens you, your gun is your solution. Whereas I would say most Democrat households, people, whatnot, thoughts are, if I don't like it, I've got to get the law changed. I've got to talk to Congress. I've got to go to the community. I've got to go to a protest. I've got to vote. We're not being raised with the ends-all option of a gun. So you can't paint Democrat. That's why I always say it. Sure to hell, probably most likely wasn't a Democrat who did the violent act. It's almost always a MAGA Republican, because they're raised like that. They're raised like that. Democrats aren't raised like that. But they also, okay, here's the thing. Here's the thing where it triggered the thought in my head of, oh my God, I've been through this. I know this. Is because, as I wrote on my community board, my dad was in a religious cult, which I didn't know as a kid. It wasn't until I was a teenager where I was with this girl. We were driving to we were in drill team, flag corps, and we were driving to Pizza Hut for an event, like after a football game or something. And we drove by this little church in town, and she said, that's the Church of God. Something like that, the Children of God. And I said, oh, my dad was in that church. And she said, that's a cult. And then someone else, when I was like 21, they said the same thing. They said, oh, that's a cult. And I was like, wow. And all these images of my dad and standing on the street corner in our small town with him and these other guys in their suits and their hat and their that shady look, the sun on their backs, so their faces were shadowy. And then us in the church basement, and all the women were like silent, almost like non-existent, slaves to the men, and the men had all the power, and my dad would give all them, and he would yell Bible verses at us and whip us every day because we didn't do something he liked. He told me I was a devil when I was dancing one time, and I couldn't move around the house, and it was really bad situation. It was very abusive, very bad. He threatened to kill people, knocked my mom's tooth out, etc., etc. So, but who could you go to? We're in a cult. We're in a religious cult. It wasn't just a cult, it was a religious cult, a community. And they all thought that they were doing the right thing. Spoil the rod, spare the child. Spare the child, what is it? Spare the rod, spoil the child. Beat your wife into submission. My wife belongs in the kitchen, pregnant and barefoot. This is God's way. It's what they believe. It's God's way. I believe that that's actually the opposite of what God believes. And that Jesus did not ever hold a gun. Never. He said, turn the other cheek. And so but the problem is they're in a cult, and a cult teaches you that your savior is your abuser. Your abuser is your savior. And so my mother, thank God, divorced my dad. House was free of him. I, had that freedom. My mother had her issues, but, at least he was gone. The house is completely different. And then years go on, and my father dies. And we go to his wake. I didn't go to his funeral, but I went to his wake. And the cult members were there. The church members were there. And even his sister, my beautiful aunt, whom I love, had this picture of my father that was like this beautiful picture of and they all had this beautiful picture and the eulogies of this beautiful man they loved, community and the church and their cult. And I have in my head the memory of him trying to kill a dog, and my brother crying in the rain holding a puppy outside, and my dad driving on sidewalks trying to kill people on the sidewalk, and knocking my mother's tooth out, and him whipping us every day, and him being in the basement with his Bible, and all these things of my dad, violent imagery of my father. And I thought, this is what this feels like when people talk about Charlie K. They have their version of him that is, oh, he was such a good Christian man, and he was a man of God, and it was like this, the light was on him, and yada yada. There's a spider. That spider just jumped out of nowhere. And that's what cults do. And so, the MAGA, I've been saying for a long time, MAGA is a cult. The far right is a cult. 45 is the cult leader, like Jim Jones. And apparently Charlie K was a huge figure in the cult. And they can't get to that cult mentality to see the truth. Just like with my dad, they all thought he was this great guy, and he wasn't. The reality was he wasn't. But could I tell them that? Would they believe me? Cults tell the other cult members that anyone outside of the cult is evil, is violent, is bad, should be eliminated, should be hurt, should be silenced. You notice how now the whole thing is to silence us and take away our First Amendment right to speak. Why? Because when you speak, you tell truths. So, and that's what it reminded me of. So this lady at work, that look on her face, and other people of, oh my God, and they're crying over him, and I'm thinking, I cry for what happened to him. I cry that we would treat another human being like that, but I also cry for the people that he's hurt when he was alive, and he said horrible things about them. And in fact, 2 men were lynched under that same mentality. People have lost jobs, livelihoods. Women have lost their lives because they lost their rights to their body. Or their husbands beat them, because now we're saying that it's okay for men to beat their wives. And we're in the cult mentality. That's part of a cult too, is to treat women like that. That's very culty. Anyway, that's what it reminded me of. So then there was another like reader, like, okay, I've already known that this reader, she pretends she's kind of like Doreen Virtue. She still says that she's like in the light, but she actually holds on to really, really dark idealism. And and she was saying how it's like dark forces, dark forces are trying to tell her that Charlie K was not a nice person. Well, that's really up to God, right? That's up to God. It's not up to us. It's up to the universe. But what are actions? And words are actions. Words are actions. And what was he saying? Again, the Wild West. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. I don't agree with it. I don't promote it. But that's a truth. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword. So I don't know. Anyway, she was saying dark forces and dark witchcraft and blah 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 blah. And she was trying to shame people. This is what cults do. Shame people into being quiet and not saying how they felt. Here's my final imagery of this. When she was saying that, I thought of how Jenny in Forrest Gump, you know how Jenny, she's clearly being essayed by her father in her childhood. And there's that scene in Forrest Gump where she takes him to the cornfield and runs away from her father. And she says, pray with me, Forrest. Dear God, make me a bird so I can fly far, far, far away from here. And then later, and we see Jenny in the course of her 20s, and 30s, and she has drug addictions and sexual addictions because she's working out the abuse, that she has no value as a human being. And that's a funny thing that abuse and cults do to people. It takes away their value as a human being. And so and then she's like suicidal and all these things. She finally starts to work it out, and she goes back with Forrest, and she lives with them for a while. And there's that scene where they're walking down the road and they come upon her dad's old house, and she just gets no words, just starts grabbing rocks and throws them at the house. And she's like, help me, Forrest. And so he's throwing rocks too. And then finally she falls down and she's just crying and crying. She's finally met the ghost of her father, right, of his abuse. And then, of course, Forrest, in his comical way and simple way, says, I guess sometimes there just aren't enough rocks, or something like that. But the thing is, you can't tell someone who's been abused, who's being abused, who's been abused, you can't tell them how to process abuse. You can't. And many abuse victims are happy when their abuser passes away. Many abuse victims wish their abuser would pass away. That's a natural feeling. It's called survival. Nobody else was helping her. And in this situation, who's helping the victims of someone who uses a podcast? Who is MAGA reaching out to women who have been abused by their boyfriends, or victims of gun violence, or the families of the men who were just lynched? No, they just want to blame it on Democrats when it's not. Democrats, we're the ones fighting for all this stuff. We're not perfect. I'm not saying that, but my point being, don't tell people how to feel about their abuser. And people who use abusive words and taking away other people's rights. Gay rights, women's rights, children's rights, rights of ethnicity, freedom to walk down the street. Don't tell people how to feel about their abuser. And many people saw someone like Charlie and others in that whole sect, like Andrew Tate and others, see them as figures of abuse, because that's kind of what they are. And until we work on that, you can't tell people how to feel. You can't. And it's very culty to tell people how to feel about an abuser. Again, I don't agree with violence. I don't promote it. I don't like it. I don't want it. Let's work on society. Let's work on the way we're talking about and treating people in society, and stop using violence. Let's start having gun control. And let's stop, when they say it's hate speech, to say that someone's hateful. If somebody comes out and says, don't tell me, let's say Taylor Swift came out today and said, don't say that you hate me to 45. Is she bad? Should she be banned? Is she evil? Notice how she hasn't said anything. She's been very good about that, although she could go off if she wanted to. It's not hateful to tell someone that they're an abuser. And it's not hateful to be an abuse victim and wish that your abuser would go away. And it's not hateful to feel relief when your abuser goes away. And that's my whole point. Don't tell people how to feel. And don't use your psychic channel to tell people how to feel. Feel the feelings, but don't act on them. Anyway, I just wanted to get all that out. Oh, also, the last couple weeks, I was thinking about how Epstein, I've been thinking about him a lot. And then I feel like this is all a distraction from the Epstein files. I really do. I feel like he was sexually essayed through his childhood, and he carried it on. I don't excuse it. I don't like him. I don't agree with it at all. But I actually have a small bit of compassion, because I feel like he was. And I feel like 45 wasn't, but he likes the abuse of power and money. And he feels, because in his ego, sex is money. Money is sex, and abuse is power, and money is power. But for Epstein, I feel like he was essayed throughout his childhood, and it's awful, and I don't like it. But I feel like that was something that happened to him, and I feel like he has been around 45 and once the files released, it will save his soul. Epstein's family wants the files released. The victims want the files released. And 45 is running scared, and a lot of this is to avoid the files being released, but they will be. They're going to be released. And that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching.